I think it's safe to say that of Tolkien's iconic villains such as Sauron, Morgoth, the Witch King, Saruman is probably the least popular. I think some of this is because he comes across as far more mundane. He doesn't really benefit from the rule of cool, and despite Christopher Lee's awesome portrayal of him in the films, those films more or less just portray Saruman as Sauron's stooge. In reality, Saruman was playing for himself. He had betrayed both sides and had grand designs for Middle-earth. He was the dark horse of the War of the Ring, but like Germany in the World Cup, he crashed out embarrassingly early. And honestly, in my opinion, Saruman was doomed from the very start. Alright, I'm not going to go through Saruman's entire story because you probably know it already. He was the leader of the Istari, the wizards, and ended up the leader of the White Council, and based himself out of Isengard. However, Saruman became enamored with ring lore, and eventually he ended up desiring the One Ring for himself, and his servants spent many years searching for it. Not long before the War of the Ring, he isolated himself in Isengard and fortified the ancient Númenórean stronghold. He began raising an army of orcs and Dunlendings, he started aiding the enemies of Rohan, and he started using the Palantir in Orthanc. Using the Orthanc stone got Saruman into trouble. It did not take long before he encountered Sauron, who was using the Ithil stone, and had already been trying to corrupt Denethor, the steward of Gondor. Because Saruman was already well and truly corrupted by this point, and because he was not a rightful user of the Palantir, Sauron was able to dominate Saruman through the stone. This doesn't mean that Sauron mind-controlled Saruman, it just means that he essentially forced Saruman to become his vassal, and at least face-to-face, Saruman did not have the ability to decline this arrangement. However, while Saruman did coordinate with Sauron, he was absolutely not loyal to him. Saruman still desired the One Ring, which was a problem, because obviously Sauron wanted his toy back. So, Saruman directed his servants to basically mislead Sauron's servants whenever they could. For example, shortly before the War of the Ring, Saruman was becoming suspicious of Gandalf's interest in the Shire, so he made sure Sauron's servants were not informed of where the Shire was. This culminated in Saruman lying to the face of the Witch King when he and his fellow Nazgûl were searching for the One Ring. Unfortunately for Saruman, he was not as sneaky as he would have liked to be. By this point, Sauron knew that Saruman was actively hindering him, and was thus a traitor. At the same time, Gandalf escapes imprisonment upon Orthanc and ends up spreading his own news of Saruman's betrayal of the Free Peoples. So, in September 3018, Saruman has been outed as a traitor to both sides, and while he's nominally still aligned with Sauron, I think both of them are aware at this point that this is now just an alliance of convenience. If Sauron beats the Free Peoples, Saruman is going to be next. So what does Saruman do now? Well, it's not like he can just say sorry and rejoin either side. He needs to continue on his current trajectory, fight on Sauron's side in the upcoming war, and hope that he can either make himself useful enough to Sauron to avoid being disposed of, or amass enough of his own power to be able to fight Sauron afterwards, possibly by obtaining a little trinket called the One Ring, which I'll talk more about soon. Immediately facing Isengard is Rohan, and with plenty of fertile land to be exploited and a large population to be enslaved, taking the kingdom is vital to Saruman expanding his war machine. The main problem for Saruman is that, on his own, he's actually not that powerful. Of the four main players in the Southern Theatre of the War of the Ring, Gondor, Rohan, Mordor and Isengard, Isengard is arguably the weakest. Isengard has somewhere between 10 to 15,000 soldiers in total, and while Isengard does have some capable units such as heavily armoured half-orcs and Uruk-hai, a lot of the army is made up of regular orcs and poorly armed Dunlendings who are probably not so committed to the cause. And unlike Sauron, Saruman doesn't have a vast network of allies to pull soldiers from. He has his own orcs and Dunland. Arguably, Saruman's greatest asset is Isengard itself, which at least is, on paper, a fairly defendable fortress. In comparison to Isengard, Rohan has over 12,000 soldiers, and has something Saruman lacks in great numbers: skilled, heavy cavalry. In comparison, Saruman only has some Dunlending horsemen and goblin wolf riders at his disposal, none of which can match the Rohirrim. On top of that, Rohan has several capable commanders and leaders, has a vast swathe of terrain that suits their style of warfare, and has the highly defensible fortress of Helm's Deep that poses a significant obstacle for any force that wants to march on Edoras. It's very clear to Saruman that if he fights a pitched battle with Rohan, he will lose. So, credit to Saruman, he works at weakening the kingdom from within. Grima, Theoden's chief advisor, secretly enters the service of Saruman and he begins wreaking havoc in Rohan's court. Theoden is weakened, Rohan's army is paralysed, and defending the kingdom comes down to local commanders. Theodred is killed in the first battle of the Fords of Isen, and mere days later, Eomer is imprisoned thanks to the machinations of Grima. On the eve of Saruman's invasion, Rohan is fighting while seated on a chair with one arm tied behind its back. Unfortunately for Saruman, this gets undone by the arrival of Gandalf. Theoden is cured of his illness, he rides to Helm's Deep, and there Isengard's army is defeated. However, it's worth noting that even if Saruman won the Battle of Helm's Deep, his army likely would have been ravaged, unable to do much else. If Isengard took the fortress before Theoden's reinforcements arrived, casualties would have been far less, but beyond Helm's Deep, Saruman still needs to take Edoras, possibly Dunharrow, and he needs to contest with Rohan's unraised forces, which would likely spring into action once they realised how dire the situation was. In conclusion, even if everything had gone perfectly for Saruman, he probably doesn't conquer Rohan without his army taking enormous losses, and these are losses that he simply cannot afford. But what happened at Helm's Deep is only half the story. The other half takes place at Isengard itself. Shortly after Isengard's army marches forth, the Ents attack Isengard, effectively destroying Saruman's war machine. This is because Saruman needed fuel to feed said war machine, and he short-sightedly decided to harvest this fuel from Fangorn Forest. This earned the attention of the Ents, and upon the arrival of Merry and Pippin, they gathered together, debated a possible course of action, and then marched on Isengard. So regardless if Saruman's army wins in the field, they are now stranded, without hope of resupply and reinforcements, because Isengard has been destroyed behind them. So even if Saruman conquers Rohan, his army is a shell of its former self, and Isengard has been destroyed by the Ents. While Saruman has succeeded in his task of removing Rohan from the war, a major player, and while I'm sure Sauron would be pleased, in doing so, Saruman would have effectively removed himself from the war as well. He would not be able to rebuild both the walls of Isengard and his army. He would not be able to extract resources from Rohan, he would not be able to participate in the attack on Gondor, and most importantly, he would have zero leverage over Sauron afterwards. His army is weak, his fortress is destroyed, Sauron doesn't forgive traitors, why would he keep Saruman around? What I'm saying here is that, militarily, Isengard was simply too weak to stand alone. Despite Saruman's schemes against Rohan, despite how rapidly he built up his war machine, the grim reality for him is that he did not have enough soldiers. He could not afford mistakes like Sauron could, he could not take losses like Sauron could. He was always much more vulnerable than the Dark Lord. Whether it was at Helm's Deep, Isengard itself, or at the hands of Sauron after the war, a reckoning was coming for Saruman. By betraying both Sauron and the Free Peoples, he had left himself in a no-man's land. All that being said, I've been purposefully leaving out the most important part of Saruman's plan, because you can separate it from the rest, and this was to get his hands on the One Ring. From Saruman's perspective, if he got his hands on the One Ring, he would be able to overcome both Sauron and the Free Peoples. And while Saruman with the One Ring would be a great threat, it's also very likely that it would not have changed the outcome. The One Ring was a force multiplier, it wasn't an instant win card, at least probably not for Saruman, and as I said before, Saruman did not have enough forces. Alright, so once again, to be fair to Saruman, he did get quite close to getting the One Ring for himself. His forces were able to track down and then intercept the Fellowship at Amon Hen, with specific orders to seize the Halflings. Saruman's forces, led by Ugluk, were successful in this, but the problem is that they seized the wrong Halflings. Unlike in the films, Frodo was not in danger of being captured at Amon Hen. After evading a temporarily corrupted Boromir, he returned to the boats in secret and escaped, only being tracked down by Sam. Frodo was not near to fighting at all, in fact he didn't even know that the rest of the Fellowship was under attack. Assuming he did run into Saruman's Uruks, he could have just used the One Ring to get away. In other words, capturing Frodo and the One Ring would have been absurdly difficult. But even if Saruman had taken the One Ring, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that it wouldn't have made the difference that he would have hoped. Sauron's greatest fear was someone using the One Ring against him. And to be fair, he was right to be afraid. As Tolkien explained, if someone were to properly master the One Ring, as in bend it to their own will, it would be the same outcome for Sauron as if the One Ring were destroyed. he would be destroyed. But because the power within the One Ring is still evil, that person would still get corrupted and he would be unable to use it to do good. This, however, as Tolkien explains in Letter 246, was not a likely scenario. Firstly, Tolkien states that no mortal, not even Aragorn, could have withheld the One Ring from Sauron in a direct contest. He then also writes that a few other powerful characters also would not have stood a chance against Sauron. In the Mirror of Galadriel, it appears that Galadriel conceived of herself as capable of wielding the ring and supplanting the Dark Lord. If so, so also were the other Guardians of the Three, especially Elrond. But this is another matter. It was part of the essential deceit of the ring to fill minds with imaginations of supreme power, but this the Great had well considered and had rejected, as is seen in Elrond's words at the Council. Galadriel's rejection of the temptation was founded upon previous thought and resolve. So who would stand a chance against Sauron in a direct contest? Tolkien is clear, only Gandalf. He writes, "Of the others, only Gandalf might be expected to master him, being an emissary of the powers and a creature of the same order, an immortal spirit taking a visible physical form." And afterwards he also writes, "One can imagine the scene in which Gandalf, say, was placed in such a position. It would be a delicate balance. On one side, the true allegiance of the ring to Sauron, on the other, superior strength because Sauron was not actually in possession, and perhaps also because he was weakened by long corruption and expenditure of will in dominating inferiors. If Gandalf proved the victor, the result would have been the same for Sauron as the destruction of the ring. For him, it would have been destroyed, taken from him forever. But the ring and all its works would have endured. It would have been the master in the end." So as far as we're aware, Gandalf is the only one that could use the One Ring in a direct contest with Sauron with some chance of success, therefore gaining mastery over it. Notably missing is a mention of Saruman. However, Tolkien does say that part of the reason why Gandalf could contest Sauron is because he's a creature of the same order as Sauron, a fellow Maya. Saruman is also this, so if Gandalf could be expected to stand a chance against Sauron, then why not Saruman? While Tolkien never seems to explicitly rule out Saruman, Letter 131 does cast some doubts on his ability to master the One Ring. Unless some other seized it and became possessed of it. If that happened, the new possessor could, if sufficiently strong and heroic by nature, challenge Sauron, become master of all that he had learned or done since the making of the One Ring, and so overthrow him and usurp his place. The most important part of these two sentences is the sufficiently strong and heroic by nature part. While Saruman is certainly strong, he's also certainly not heroic by nature. He's selfish, envious, traitorous, petty. He's even less heroic than Sauron. In fact, there's plenty of evidence in the books that suggests that Saruman wouldn't be able to master the One Ring. Saruman tries to create his own ring of power and just isn't able to get it right. Saruman literally gets dominated in a face-to-face meeting with Sauron through the Palantir. Isengard is just a pale imitation of Barad-dûr. Saruman's army is magnitude smaller than Sauron. Saruman is basically just Sauron from Timu in many ways. I think the best description is this one. But Saruman had slowly shaped Isengard to his shifting purposes and made it better, as he thought, being deceived, for all those arts and subtle devices for which he forsook his former wisdom, and which fondly he imagined were his own, came but from Mordor, so that what he made was naught, only a little copy, a child's model or a slave's flattery, of that vast fortress, armory, prison, furnace of great power, Barad-dûr, the Dark Tower, which suffered no rival, and laughed at flattery, biding its time, secure in its pride and its immeasurable strength. So, while never explicitly ruled out, I think there's enough evidence to suggest that Saruman could not have mastered the One Ring. By every measurement, he's lesser than Sauron, and unlike Gandalf, I think he lacks the innate strength and fortitude to be able to overcome Sauron's power. But there's an important distinction to be made. Mastering and using the One Ring are not the same thing. As I said, mastering the One Ring is effectively wrenching control of it and making the power your own, which would destroy Sauron. Using the One Ring is, well, trying to use Sauron's power against him. I'll let Letter 246 describe it to you. But this, the Great had well considered and had rejected, as is seen in Elrond's words at the Council. Galadriel's rejection of the temptation was founded upon previous thought and resolve. In any case, Elrond or Galadriel would have proceeded in the policy now adopted by Sauron. They would have built up an empire with great and absolutely subservient generals and armies and engines of war until they could challenge Sauron and destroy him by force. So if Saruman got his hands on the One Ring, he would need to use it to gather a force to challenge Sauron through military might. But then the question is, could Saruman do this? As I said earlier, Saruman's military stocks were relatively limited, drawing from just his own orcs he bred and the Dunlendings. If he was to challenge Sauron, he would need far more than that. But the problem for Saruman is, where? One possible place is the Misty Mountains, but the orcs in those mountains weren't exactly overly powerful themselves anymore. There were also a few other relatively neutral parties, the men who dwelt in Enedwaith, the men of Bree, those in Erin Vaughn, but once again, none of these groups are powerful. Therefore, what Saruman would be required to do is to coerce forces from the Free Peoples and Sauron's dominions into serving him. The voice of Saruman was a potent weapon, and it would only be enhanced by the One Ring, so I have no doubt that Saruman would have the ability to convince some, possibly many, to switch sides. But would it be enough? I'm not so sure. The problem is that this would take time, and it would require Saruman to be at the head of his army and travel around in person. You also have to make the assumption that there would still be plenty of people who would oppose him, amongst the Free Peoples and Sauron's forces. Remember, the One Ring amplifies one's skills and abilities, but it is still not a mind control device. The main issue for Saruman would be a swift and decisive attack by Sauron, possibly with the Dark Lord himself leading the army, just to make sure Saruman can't pull any tricks. Now, interestingly enough, Sauron didn't seem too concerned when he believed Saruman had the One Ring when Pippin accidentally revealed himself in the Palantir. He just said, "Sit tight, I'm sending someone to pick it up." This could work to Saruman's advantage, because if Sauron underestimated him, that might give him time to further strengthen his own position. Or alternatively, it could mean that Sauron had good reason to be confident that even with the One Ring, Saruman wasn't a massive threat to him. Either way, with Saruman unlikely to have the strength to master the One Ring, it means that he would have to bring Sauron down through military might, and assuming Saruman gets the One Ring before he attacks Rohan, that is no easy task. In fact, I'd say it's still nigh impossible. Remember, Saruman has 10 to 15,000 soldiers in total, Sauron has hundreds of thousands. And even though the One Ring is a powerful artifact, it cannot conjure miracles. We saw this at the War of the Last Alliance. Despite having the One Ring, Sauron still got defeated by his superior foes. What this means is that unless Saruman was able to do the unthinkable and somehow rally the Free Peoples behind him and cause mass defections amongst Sauron's own forces, there still would not have been a way for him to win. And that's ultimately why Saruman was doomed from the start. He was simply not powerful enough in terms of military strength. He could not throw away armies and replace them like Sauron. His army was a one and done, sent forth, destroyed, not to be replaced. And despite Isengard not being a pushover, it lacked the impregnability of Mordor, and was thus undone by the Ents. And when it came to the One Ring, well, it was always going to be difficult to acquire, and Saruman was perhaps a little delusional about what he could achieve with it. And I think this contributes as to why Saruman is far less popular than other villains. He's just a cheap knockoff of Sauron who never really had a chance. Sure, he was competent at times. His plan to cripple Rohan was only thwarted by the sudden return of Gandalf. His minions managed to track the Fellowship. He played both sides well for at least a while, and he displayed some strategic acumen with the battles at the Fords of Isen. But ultimately, whether his plans failed due to bad luck or poor execution, the problem Saruman had is that he was far too ambitious for what he had at his disposal. In the end, I'm not sure if he could have been successful while flying his own banner. He didn't have the strength to be a genuine third player. He really should have just either stayed loyal to Sauron or the Free Peoples. But then, he wouldn't be Saruman. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. I kind of wanted to do a hit piece on Saruman for a long time because, yeah, while he's a cool, important character, he's also kind of pathetic and an idiot. I didn't even speak about how lame he is during the scouring of the Shire. Instead, I decided to make it more respectable and hopefully more interesting. As for my assertion that Saruman is less popular than other villains, Well, I've seen this with myself and other YouTubers firsthand. Saruman videos never do as well as those about Sauron and Morgoth. Hopefully this one goes alright. Cheers, farewell, and remember, doing videos where I talk about both Sauron and Saruman always makes me chuckle because Tolkien not only made Saruman a cheap knockoff of Sauron, but he also gave him a name that's similar too.